Hello, I'm Doug Maw. Welcome to my channel, Vegangelical. I hope you enjoy my content and find it useful, especially if you're an activist or you're involved in the animal agriculture industry. Then I hope you'll find it informative and helpful in trying to save you from going through some of the trauma that I've been through myself. So in my last episode, I talked about the humane slaughter of cows, and before I start this one, I'd just like to say I really appreciate it if you could like, share, subscribe and comment on my videos, because I'm obviously wanting to increase the views and try and reach the people that I'm aiming to reach, ideally those involved with animal agriculture as well as activists. So that said, check out the links in my videos as well, and hopefully you'll find something useful there. Now, this is part 2 of my humane slaughter series, and today I'm talking about lambs. So why do I say lambs and not sheep? Because lambs are baby sheep basically, so they are killed at anything between 10 weeks and 1 year old. Particularly your Easter lamb is killed very young because they are selectively impregnated to ensure that they can maximize profits for farmers. So that means being born in the winter months in order to be at a saleable age in Easter. So it's very rare that you'll get lambs born before Christmas, so you tend to find them lambing season quite often is around February, so they're very young when it comes to Easter. As I say, the average age of a lamb at slaughter is 6 to 7 months. They can be anything up to a year and anything as young as 10 weeks, as I said. So we are talking about lambs, not sheep. Sheep will obviously, once they are considered spent, the wool is not valuable enough for them to continue being kept for that. So when they are considered spent, they are sent to slaughter as mutton. So after a couple of cycles of pregnancies, that's the end of that ewe. One of the biggest problems with lamb is this perception of it being more ethical meat than some of the other meats. And the reason I hear that explanation is people will say to me, well, I see lambs with ewes in the fields. I don't often see calves with cows, and I don't often see piglets with sows, and certainly not in fields. And so there's this perception that it's more natural, they're allowed to stay with their mothers and live this idyllic life in fields. Now, when I tell you that lambs can live to be 28 years old and are slaughtered on average at 6 to 7 months old, and maximum is usually, as I say, a year and as young as 10 weeks, then you have to question just how humane and ethical that is, to take away the life of what could have been a 28-year-old being at such a young age. So yes, you may see them in the fields with their mothers, but not for very long. One of the other problems is, as I said, the time they're impregnated to make them as profitable as possible for the farmer means that they are born at a time of year when it's particularly harsh, and the conditions mean that 20% of lambs born in the UK die. Basically, it's a 20% mortality rate. So being born in the winter in the cold of England and Scotland, in Wales, it can be particularly harsh, and that accounts for a lot of the mortality rate of young lambs. They'll blame other things, farmers, but that is the primary reason. The other main reason is because they've been selectively bred, these ewes, to produce larger litters than they normally would have. So wild sheep would almost always produce just one lamb. In the farming industry, they are bred so that they can produce 2, 3 or even more, and that's another reason there's a high mortality rate, because the ewe can't look after as well a number of lambs as it can obviously with just one. So that's another reason that I look at lamb and I'm a little bit astonished when people say it's more ethical than other animals. So that said, what happens at the slaughterhouse? So I worked in smaller scale slaughterhouses, so you'd think more time to do the killing, more space, less pressure. You'd think more ethical. Well, let me describe the process. So the lambs are put in a holding pen where they can see, hear and smell what's going on around them. And lambs are very aware. They have incredibly complex brains and they certainly know what's going on around them. So when they're hearing and seeing and smelling what's happening in a slaughterhouse, their reaction is just like the reaction I described of the cows. They either respond with fear, and that comes in the form of crouching down, trying to hide, lots of bleating, crying out and shivering, shaking. So that's fear. The second way they respond is flight. So they'll attempt to run away. They'll try and get past you when you're in the run trying to catch them. And the third response is to fight. So especially when you get to the very end of the run and there's only a couple of handful of lambs left in there, they will leap at you and try and headbutt you and anything to try and stave off their execution for as long as they can. So those three responses, exactly the same as I described with cows, and so they're in a freer space than cows are, so they're more able to attempt the flee and the fight responses than a cow is, which is trapped in a small box. The way it happens then is, so someone will go into the run, the pen, and they will bring them out individually. So you take the lamb, and there are 2 soft spots on the lamb around the neck and under the groin area. It's a loose flap of skin. So someone would grab them like this, they'd turn them over and present them onto a low metal rack where someone is supposed to apply an electric current in the form of tongs, like so, to the temples, and it's supposed to render the lamb unconscious, at which point the throat is slit and the lamb dies of exsanguination, which means being bled to death, basically. Now, ideally, it's supposed to be unconscious when this happens. Now, the problem with that is, just like cows, they don't keep still because they don't want to die. So when you're placing them on the rack, it's a little bit easier than a cow because you can use your physical strength and weight to hold them down. So although they're grown very quickly in the short lives they have, most human beings are able to hold them down with a bit of pressure. So you'll see people using their foot, their knee, their elbow, their forearm, just to apply pressure to keep them in place, while another slaughterhouse worker will apply the tongs to the head and attempt to induce unconsciousness. What goes wrong there is, even with your weight on them, the heads cannot be kept entirely still, and if you think you're going to be killed, you're not going to stay still. You're going to be moving your head around to try and avoid something being attached to run a current through your head. They may or may not know that's what it is, but they certainly know what the results are because they'll have seen it all around them. So when they're not keeping still, it's incredibly hard to get them tongues in the right place, or even at all. The amount of times I carried lambs out to those racks and ended up getting currents passed through my hand or arm from someone desperately trying to attach it to the lamb's head, I've lost count of. It was probably at least as often as not. So probably 50% of the time the current would go into my hand, which would mean one of two things. Either the person applying the electric shock would have to make repeated attempts to try and render the lamb unconscious, or they would miss the fact that it hadn't been and bleed it without first rendering it unconscious. So that is pretty much how a lamb is killed. And I could talk about a lot more to do with lambing and sheep, and I probably will in a future episode. This one I want to keep fairly short, just on these absolute terms of how animals are killed in what we term humane slaughter. So ask yourself this: if you could put yourself in a position of how I've just described the experience of the lamb in the slaughterhouse, would you describe it as humane? If it is humane, then why don't we bring our pets to slaughterhouses to have them put to sleep? Why don't, when people go to euthanasia clinics in Switzerland, why don't they ask for them to apply an electric current, well, hold them down, apply an electric current to their brain and then slit their throat? The reason why is it's not humane. It's not humane at all. If it was, we wouldn't see the fear, flight and fight response, which is common in any animal, including humans, as a response to a threat, especially one that's a threat to their lives. So I hope that's been clear. I hope it's helpful. I hope you've learned a little bit more about lambs and their lives. I can't remember if I said earlier in the video, but they can live to 28 years old, and they're being killed from 10 weeks to a year, most often 6 to 7 months. So that's the experience. In the last figures I have are from 2020, there were over 15 million lambs killed for food in the UK alone. And that is a huge, staggering number. And there were only ever 33 million lambs in the UK at one time. So half of those are killed every year. So it doesn't take a lot to figure out the level of suffering this so-called animal loving nation puts lambs through, just so that people can have a meal, especially at Easter. It seems to be the done thing to eat lamb, and I hope people will reconsider what they put on their plates this Easter, and you'll go for a vegan option, which involves no suffering or death, certainly far less than any animal product. I hope you'll also consider, if you do work in animal agriculture, especially slaughterhouses, the effect this is going to have on you. I'll talk a lot more about that in future videos, because what you're doing now is setting you up for a lot of suffering in future. I speak from experience. This is not scaremongering, it's fact. People really suffer from what they do, and rightly so, because what we were doing is not a natural thing for humans to be doing. And it's scary and it's horrific, and you normalize some kind of vicious, violent behaviors. At some point down the line, you're going to pay the price for that, whether it's just lost sleep, suicidal thoughts, violence in your everyday life, all sorts of ways this plays out. So please have a think about that and look into lambs. There's some brilliant resources out there. Have a look at Viva's page, There's fact sheets on lambs that will tell you a lot more about them, their intelligence, their sociability, and what they're capable of. So please consider going vegan this Easter. Put peace on your plate. Thank you for listening. As always, leave me any comments, any feedback, any suggestions, from the technical side as well, because I'm still new to all this. I'm trying all kinds of new ways of doing these talks and trying to put it across in a way that's user friendly. I may be failing, so I'm open to suggestions. And if you check out the links, consider maybe supporting me on Patreon. That'll give me far more time to get my message across and far more opportunity to talk to the communities and the people that I really want to reach. And have a peaceful Easter.